All right, it's April 9th, 2020. This is another episode of Sorry for Rambling. I'm Alex Kack, and I'm joined today by Scott Santens. Scott, been starting all these off the last couple weeks with the same question, which is a weird one, but it feels kind of necessary, which is, how are you doing? Are you okay? Are you safe? Your family and friends, are they healthy?
Yep. I'm doing well. I actually live here in New Orleans, so it's one of the hotspot areas. But it seems to be uh, getting better here. Like we may have hit the peak already. But yeah, just we've been indoors now for just almost a month at this point. It feels like we were one of the first ones to kind of lock down. But yeah, I'm doing great, and yeah, we're good here.
I'm very happy to hear that. I know I was curious about that specifically and asking you that because you are in New Orleans, and I mean, I think we've around the country we've seen some of the images. We saw people going down the corridor, literally the police literally clearing people out several weeks ago, which was kind of
Yeah.
startling. Well, it's my favorite city in America, and I'm glad to hear that things are
Oh, it's good to
hopefully getting
hear.
better there.
Yeah.
Let me preface non Tucson category.
Understood.
Before I offend my city and countrymen here. I want to so right off the bat, you sit on the board for the Fund for Humanity. Can you tell people a little bit about what that is, what you do there?
Yeah, so I'm just one of the directors of the board. The Fund for Humanity, the full name is the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity. It was set up after by Giselle Huff, the mother of Gerald Huff, is a friend of mine who was a basic income advocate and a one of the actually the principal software engineer at Tesla when he died recently. And so this was set up in his name, and really the purpose of it was to carry on what was important to him, which was getting basic income, mainstreamed and advancing that. Not only the discussion, but in a real way. So that's what we've been doing. Like one of the first things we did was helped fund the basic income marches that happened across the country, even the world last year, and we'll be doing it again this year. And it's really just about figuring out how can we really get the resources to people and projects that will advance basic income.
So obviously, I mean, universal basic income has really exploded in the last year. I think as far as people's awareness of it as a potential policy, as a potential solution for a lot of societal problems. But it has a very long legacy. What are your thoughts on that and on the evolution of it over the last roughly 100 years or so?
Yeah, so it was pretty much entirely unknown to me back in 2013, and it was when I kind of fell down that rabbit hole and I started researching it and learning about the history that I was just kind of blown away by basically even how close we were in the 70s. And so I didn't know that Nixon had proposed a guaranteed income. It wasn't a universal basic income, as we mostly discuss it today. It was basically a negative income tax variant, and it was for families and not for everybody. But the idea would have been and was unprecedented as far as this income guarantee approach, as being we don't care about why, let's say you only have $200 per month or less. It's like we care that you are in deep poverty and we want to fix that. And that approach was just, instead of like blaming people for being in poverty, it was like, hey, let's just basically dramatically reduce poverty. And Nixon was for that. So he proposed that in 1969. And 1,200 economists signed a statement in support of this approach in the late 60s as well. And this bill called the Family Assistance Plan passed the House of Representatives in 1970 and in 1971 to go on to the Senate. And both times it did not get through the Senate. But if it would have, then it would have been signed into law by Nixon. and we would have been the first country in the world to guarantee an income floor for families. And as part of that in the 70s too, we did experiments across the country. So the first one was in New Jersey, and from there we also did experiments in North Carolina and Gary, Indiana, and Seattle and Denver. All of these were this was like the first like major social experiments, doing like thousands of people, and we were designing it as far as like different clawback rates, different amounts to try to see what the effect on work was. And Canada actually followed suit too. So Canada saw what we were doing, and they did a Mincome experiment in Manitoba. And the city of Dauphin, Manitoba, effectively eliminated poverty entirely for 5 years doing this experiment. It was a full saturation experiment of the entire town, and the results were just incredible. Like it was really diving into this history and studying what was learned in the 70s and even more recently that really got me on board, because I've just did more kind of evidence based in my thinking. So this wasn't just like oh, this sounds good philosophically. This has a rich background of support and an evidence base to support it as well. And I recommend people really kind of get into this, learn more about it, the history, and learn more about all these different experiments that have gone on both then and far more recently.
Speaking of that, I mean, what are some of the best places for people to start learning about basic income? Is there are there books that you recommend people look to, or online resources?
Yeah, I've tried to make a couple different resources easily available for people, actually on my website. So if you go to scottsantens.com, you can find my FAQ, which goes into a lot of commonly asked questions, and there's basically an answer via an article form for each of those commonly asked questions. And also one of those questions is like what books you can read. So there's even an article about what are all the books about basic income. I call it the like the basic income library. So you can just Google basic income library, you'll find this list of books that I compiled. And as far as like a specific book that people could start with, the most popular one is actually quite a good one. That's Andrew Yang's book, The War on Normal People, because that gets into basic income and also a lot of kind of more technological discussion. And Rutger Bregman's book is also a good entry point to that covers a little bit more than covers short work week and open borders too as part of his book. So it's not only just about basic income, but there's a lot of books out there to dive into to learn more about this. Especially like Guy Standing is great. He just seems like to write a new book every year, I feel. And Carl Widerquist is also great too. But yeah, just look for something. And also Tyranny of Kindness is one that I recommend as well. This book it actually came out, I think it came out in the 90s. And that's just it's a really good book as far as learning more about, not so much about basic income, but for the need for basic income based on like a greater understanding of how the existing system works, like the conditional welfare system, all the ways that people can fall through it, all the ways that it fails people, and just why it is so important to have this full universality and unconditionality as a floor instead of this like net that people fall right through.
I think one of the things that has stymied or hindered the conversation around basic income in the past is, a lot of people hear it and it's, this panic goes off. It's this red scare of, socialism, Karl Marx. That I don't gather that that's your view on it at all, though. And how does that? How do you explain that difference to someone? How do you view the difference? Do you view basic income as kind of a leftist ideology or in that wheelhouse, or is it something completely different?
No, I've long described basic income as not left or right, but forward. And so when people ask about like, is it socialism or communism, a common response that I give is to say that Alaska is not a socialist or a communist state, and Milton Friedman was not a socialist or a communist. Alaska is actually the best example in the world of a basic income that has been operating for an entire area. So in the case of Alaska, everybody receives this annual dividend, and they've received it every year since 1982. And so you can look at what are the effects of someone receiving, and this amount is a smaller amount than we usually typically talk about. Say it's on average around $1,000. That's been the average for the past few decades, but it's also per person in a household. So if the amount is say $2,000 and you have a household of 5, then that's $10,000 for the year. That's like the minimum amount that you would receive as your floor. And then of course, everything you earn on top of it, you would earn on top of it. And the result is that it reduces poverty. It really stimulates the economy in Alaska. It's like effectively an entirely like new additional industry that's there. Like every year when the dividend is distributed, people spend that money. And so businesses even compete over it. So what happens is like dividend sales happen everywhere as companies compete for those spending. And that spending is something that those businesses look forward to every year. And that's just a big shot in the arm to businesses across Alaska. It also has been shown to decrease crime temporarily after that the dividend goes out as well. And it's been shown to increase, improve birth weights due to better maternal nutrition of mothers. So babies are born healthier. And they actually have seen that it actually reduces obesity as well. So there's just a lot of positive implications, a lot of positive effects, including actually increased part-time work. Part-time work in Alaska is it's been shown to increased by 17% because of the annual dividend. That was from a paper that came out last year analyzing it. And so, yeah, Alaska has a lot to say about this idea. And yeah, as far as like communism and socialism too, like Milton Friedman was a big advocate of, his version was a negative income tax, but a lot of people don't know that he was asked about universal basic income too. And he considered them as two ways of doing the same thing. He liked both universal basic income and negative income tax. And so this is something, if you're going to have a market, if you're going to have capitalism, if you're going to have people exchanging money for goods and services, you have to make sure that people actually have money. Like that is a precondition. And so you could even, if you understand that, you can see that basic income actually improves the functioning of markets, because it doesn't know, like the market cannot determine if, say, a business is doing poorly because people don't like what that business is selling, or if they do not have the money to actually buy stuff from that business. And so if you make sure that everybody has enough money to spend on goods and services, then you can actually clearly tell if, say, a business is not doing well, it's because there just isn't sufficient demand for that business and what it's selling, versus people being unable to or not wanting to due to not having enough money to actually buy stuff.
Well, and that's one of the things that always, I think, strikes me about a lot of the economic arguments that we've heard on the right for the last couple of decades, which is it. I think one of the first things that any person learns in like a high school economics class is the phrase supply and demand. And yet, since the 1980s, it seems like we have a large political movement in this country that completely forgets that demand is part of that equation. You can supply as much stuff as you want. If people cannot purchase it or pay for it, where is there potential for growth, or prosperity in any sense?
Yeah, and so that is actually key. It's a key understanding when it comes to automation as well. So, if we're producing more and more and we're producing it via machine, then what is even the point of all this? So if machines are unemploying people and they're producing all of this stuff, but then the people who are unemployed can't buy the stuff that the machines are producing, then the entire system breaks down. Like as automation increases, we actually have to decouple income from work so that people can actually spend money completely disconnected from work in order to keep going, and keep growing this productivity and keep actually utilizing the abilities of machines instead of just basically doing it all for naught. The entire purpose of machines are to actually reduce the amount of work that we need through increasing our productivity. So we have to be able to buy what it's creating.
I'm glad you brought up automation because I think it's central to the arguments that we tend to hear, especially recently with Andrew Yang's candidacy in regards to basic income. And yet the argument almost against basic income and against that is, well, for decades now, a century now, people talk about automation taking jobs, and instead the workforce just realigns. How is today different than that? How is today different than the 1950s or the 1920s or the 1980s and 90s when people, were like harbingers of doom on automation and we did not see the workforce impacted in that way, or we simply saw it realign with other kinds of work? What makes today and the future different than that?
Yeah, I think the issue here is that people think of automation as being this kind of clear impact as regards to, let's say a human doing a job and then a robot doing a job, and then that person not being able to like find any other job. But that's not really the way that it works out. So what's been happening is that automation has been with us for decades. And the way that the results have been turning out is that basically it started in the middle of the skill spectrum. So if you have like low, medium, high skill spectrum, we started out essentially with basically like car manufacturers. So if you're like an assembly line and you're a human being, and let's say you don't have a college degree, then you were earning, let's say $50,000, $60,000. Like it was a really good job. And because of that, it made a lot more sense for a robot to start doing that job, because the robot didn't need to be like super cheap. It just needed to be enough to make it profitable to replace someone who was earning like $50,000, $60,000. So you put a robot in there, and now what happens to the person? Like they just don't not do anything. They have to go back into the market. And what they do is you have to find what jobs are there. And for the most part, over the past decades, we've been creating these low-skill jobs, and that's through the service sector. And so people find these new low-skill jobs. So over the decades, we've been coring out the middle, which is essentially the middle class. And a few people, there's been some new jobs created that were high skill and pay a lot. But for the most part, we've been shifting people over to the bottom end. And therefore, that's part of the reason why we've seen stagnant wages and stagnant incomes for these decades. So since the 70s, we're actually twice as productive as we were in the 70s. But our wages, if you look at, they're essentially not moved according to inflation for that whole time. So it's really weird to think about that, how here we are twice as productive. And so we should either be all earning twice as much, or we should all be working half as much. And that should be like the result of all this increased productivity. But that's not the way that it's worked out. Inequality has instead dramatically increased, and people for the most part are finding it harder and harder to get by. Like it used to be that you could have a single income earner and you could live like the middle class lifestyle, and you didn't even need like a college degree. Now, if you want to live like the middle class lifestyle, you better have two income earners, and they both probably need to have college degrees, and they both need to be working full time. And instead, you've got a whole lot of people who are underemployed. They have degrees that are greater than what they're doing. At the same time, you have high school graduates who are unable to get a college degree, who are just completely like being left out. They used to be able to get nice jobs, and that's just done. So they're the ones that have been really hurting. They're the ones who we've been seeing this increase in deaths of despair as well for years. And that's as a result of the effects of this automation. that people, will say, oh, automation doesn't exist. It's like, not working. We have all these jobs. But the problem is that with the way automation works is to actually make jobs pay less and less and less and less, because you create this workforce of people essentially competing against each other, and because those are the only jobs that are left. And at the same time, incomes are falling, so that there's less demand in the marketplace, so that people are spending less, and therefore there's even like less jobs for that too. So it's like a big mess created by this rising automation, and it shouldn't be that way. As we improve our technological capability, as productivity improves, we should all be better off. And so if we build that basic income floor underneath us, and we even say that floor should rise with productivity, then we could literally all be better off as we automate more and more jobs. And there would actually be an incentive to automate those jobs, because we would be better off instead of being worse off for the most part, as we are now, except for, say, the billionaires and people at the top who own the technology.
You used a word earlier, and I wanted to rope back on, which was unconditional basic income. And one of the things that I think we tend to see with any type of social safety net program is means testing, an idea of who really deserves this or who doesn't. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that means testing is not the right way to roll out a basic income program?
Yeah, so if you do means test it, then it's actually not basic income. So in order to even be considered a basic income, then you need to meet some requirements. So that is, it's fully universal. It goes to rich and poor, it goes to everybody. Unconditional, which means that you get it, whether you're working or you're not working. There are no conditions to receive it. And also it's regularly provided. So it needs to be at either monthly, weekly, something that's regular, and you can depend on it. And it's an individual amount too. So it doesn't go to households. It goes to every person individually. And those all need to be part of this amount of money that to be qualified as a basic income. And so the reason unconditionality is so important is there's a few different reasons. So on the one hand, the existing means tested system, by means testing, by targeting it. So let's say you have to draw that line, and let's say you draw the line based on income, and let's say it's the way that we just did the stimulus checks right now. So let's draw the line at like $70,000. And so what you're saying is that only people below that line should receive this money, and those above it should not. As soon as you do that, then now you have to spend money to test every single person to make sure that they fit into either side of that line. So that's an administrative expense. And in regards even to right now, that's a time expense. So it's going to take a lot longer to figure out who is on either side of that line. And at the same time, too, you are going to essentially incentivize being on that side of the line. So in the way that traditional benefits work, if you are receiving, let's say, $1,000 a month of welfare, and then you are offered a job, and the job pays $1,000 a month. Let's say it's a part-time job. So your choice is to continue receiving the benefit without employment, or to employ and to not be any better off whatsoever. You're still at $1,000 per month, and now you're working, and you may even be doing something you don't want to do at all. But if you have that floor set up, because it is unconditional, then you would have $1,000 per month, and then that $1,000 per month job would then bring you up to $2,000 per month. So that's the incentive to accept that job, because now you're actually better off. And that only exists as long as you don't target it, as long as you don't means test it. Otherwise, you're effectively incentivizing the conditions to not receive it. You could say that is that basic income is not paying people to do nothing; it's paying people to do anything. If you pay people to do nothing, then you're effectively incentivizing that. But if you pay people to do anything, then anything they do is actually something that they can benefit from. So that's another reason. But also there's a when you separate that line and you separate people into two groups, then you also create a stigma, because now you have a group that you don't want to be in. If you're in that group, then it's essentially you're saying that you failed, you need help, and you don't want to make that climb. So then you have people essentially living in poverty who don't want to claim that assistance because they feel it makes them like a failure or a bad person or whatever. And so then you have people living in poverty who needlessly need not, they shouldn't need to be doing that. We want to help them, but they don't want that. So that's a problem. And then another problem too is that you have, there's a type of error that, it's type 1 and type 2, like false inclusions and false exclusions. So if you want to test this population and you want to make sure that people are in this targeted population and only they are the ones to get it, and you can hope that if you create a test that you can exclude everybody that you don't want to exclude. But when you do that, you will inevitably exclude people that you want to include. So that problem means, so it's a decision between what's more important. Do you want to exclude the people that it would say be wasteful to provide to, or do you want to exclude people that it could be fatal to not provide to? And I think especially we're in this position we're in right now, universality is extremely important, because there's just no way of knowing who really needs this and who doesn't. And it could be an absolutely fatal error to exclude people. So let's say with the $70,000 as the current line, and let's say it fades off at 99,000 as far as the stimulus check goes. So those earning over 99,000 get nothing. Well, for all we know, that's based on the previous year's taxes. So maybe someone earned $120,000 last year, and now they're unemployed and they're going hungry, and they have needs just like everybody else does. They're as broke as everybody else is. But then because you drew this line, that they're excluded. And so that's a problem with drawing that line, because you cannot know what positions people are in at any one time. But we don't have godlike powers in order to be able to determine that. And if we make sure that everybody gets it, then everybody's included. And then if you absolutely must try to exclude people, you can always just tax appropriately on the back end, next year. You can say, hey, let's raise taxes on those who are earning over $100,000 in 2020. And that way you effectively tax back what they were provided, but without the errors involved that you would have had in targeting it.
One of the, I think one of the other things that makes me often think of, I think you touched on something really interesting in the concept of the social stigma attached to it. Because what you were describing, 2 points ago, it almost sounded like a kind of class warfare on a kind of social interpersonal level, which is, I think, something that people are really missing about. People love to think of these kind of this rich versus poor dynamic, or simply from a very like policy perspective or from a needs perspective, but they tend not to think about the way that social attitudes can continue to impact that. And I think also impact people's mental health. I mean, you were talking about that quite a bit earlier. Yeah. And these are very important and maybe even dire things for us to discuss.
I'm sorry. I just want to.
No, go for
it. There's a scientific experiment here that actually leads right into what you're talking about here, and is related to this division line. So here's what happens. So you draw that line, you create that stigma, and now there's a difference. So if you are on the side of the line that gets the income, then you actually will, let's say, increase your trust in government. And you'll increase it by like 1 point, let's say. And so what's the effect of the people who don't receive it? So their distrust in government grows by 10 points. So the being excluded when you're in need actually is basically 10 times as powerful as receiving something when you are in need. And so this line that we're drawing, I think it really leads into part of the problem that you're seeing with America as far as getting more and more polarized and distrustful of government and distrustful of institutions in general, distrustful of politicians, distrustful of journalists and the media, is because when you are on that other side of that line and you really need assistance and you're not getting it, you
I think we may have lost Scott here. Um, uh, Scott, are you there?
seconds. All right, I don't know what happened there, but can you hear me now?
Yep, I think we got you back here. Let's just see if we can pull you back into the stream. There we go. All right, we got him back, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think my plug came disconnected, possibly.
Well, an interesting thing. It actually, the software we're using, the company provided me with an email a couple days ago. It said, they're having issues across streaming platforms, be it this one or Zoom or Google Hangouts, all of them, because of the load on both the software providers and then also the internet service providers. They're having a hard time keeping up and delivering the guaranteed speeds because there's so many people worldwide online right now and using these services.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see just how much of this increased usage of like teleconferencing tools continues after all this. It's just this we can talk about a little bit about that too. I think would be fun is we are changing our behaviors right now, and our behaviors. One of that is that we are, let's say, teleconferencing and telecommuting to work and stuff. And another part of our behavioral change is that we're spending less money, because there's less to do. So we're finding out things to do with our time, like let's say that aren't consumption based. So let's say, whereas you would like to go out to a bar or something, and now you're staying home, and maybe you're watching Netflix, or maybe you're deciding to read more, or maybe you're using like TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media platform that you're doing. So you're spending your time consuming differently by spending less money. And I'm really curious to see what happens after this. Like how much of that is going to continue going forward? Because if people do learn that they can spend less money and be happy with what they're doing, maybe they even found other things, maybe they found hobbies and stuff during this time that they are going to continue going forward with. Maybe someone started a podcast during this time and they're now going to devote their time to starting working on this podcast. There's all sorts of things that we're doing right now that's different, and I think that a lot of that will stick going forward. And there's also the implications too, as far as, we are, how excited are we going to be about hopping on planes and going on cruises and, going to packed stadiums and these kinds of things. There are going to be people thinking, just because we're past this pandemic doesn't mean there's going to be something else. It doesn't mean they're gone now. So maybe I'll try to spend just a little bit less time going in large groups, and that kind of stuff will absolutely impact our economy going forward. And of course, another thing that'll impact it too is the fact that robots don't get sick. So I think we're going to see a lot more automation coming up too. All these people that are being unemployed, I think businesses are going to discover, just as they're discovering that they didn't need to be, say, flying people around and they could have just been teleconferencing. They're going to discover that, we actually didn't need, say, 100 people. We can actually do what we were doing by only hiring back 60, or maybe we could even hire back 30 and hire some robots or install some software, and that'll enable us to get by instead of going back to a full workforce of 100. It'll be really interesting to see what these effects are.
I mean, I couldn't agree more, and I think there's big policy implications too. I mean, we've been talking throughout the course of this episode about universal basic income, which is at its core a government spending program, but it's also, I think, this moment in history is revealing other types of spending that we have failed or fallen short on. It's exposing the frailty of the American healthcare system. That's obviously in the media and being talked about a lot by politicians in both spectrums, and certainly we're seeing by foreign governments who are actively advising people to avoid America because of it. One of the other things that I think we're seeing is, and this is something I've been spending a lot of time reading about, but I'm kind of almost amazed we're not talking about it more, is preparedness and also medical and scientific research and the kind of fractured system we have on that. We have multiple vaccines going into trial around the country, and from what I've gathered, a lot of them are based off of a SARS vaccine that was promising, seemed to be effective, and then was abandoned because SARS didn't seem like a big deal anymore. We're seeing there was another project I was reading about that was kind of a broad spectrum antiviral medication that was promising on a number of different types of coronaviruses, as well as several other common types of viruses. And that was abandoned ship because it fell into this thing that apparently is called, I think it's the Valley of Death or the Valley of something like that, where there's basically a stopgap between where corporate funding will start on a project versus where public funding ends. And apparently lots of therapies and treatments die in this kind of middle ground that are very promising or could have been advancing us by decades scientifically and medically. Do you see all of these things as interconnected? Do you see all of these types of policies, whether it's basic income or healthcare guarantees or scientific research? Do you see a connectivity to these things, or are they individualized packaged programs?
Oh no, absolutely, it's connected. I like to describe basic income as a missing foundation. Like, we have a civilization that is missing a foundation. We basically built like a giant like skyscraper on top of like swampland, without building a foundation. And now we're wondering like why there are cracks and why it's leaning and why things are like breaking. And it's because we didn't have a foundation. So if we build that foundation, we make sure that everybody has that unconditional economic security, then it really impacts all these things. So like when you look at healthcare, one of the results from the Dalton experiment was a reduction in hospitalization rates by 8.5%, and that was due to reduced stress was like the main thing. And we see an experiment over and over again that health improves. So part of that is because 80 to 90% of health outcomes are determined by what's called the social determinants of health. So if you're living in poverty, then a lot of times we're basically treating poverty at the back end, downstream, through this really expensive healthcare that we could have entirely avoided had we just made sure that person wasn't living in poverty. And it's so much cheaper to actually impact people upstream. It's basically a vaccine approach. You could look at basic income as a social vaccine, because it would prevent people from falling into poverty and then our having to spend all that money on otherwise. When it comes to like a universal healthcare system, yes, we absolutely should have a universal healthcare system, and it should be disconnected from labor. It should be connected to something like citizenship or residency. As a person, we need to make sure that you get access to healthcare and also access to income. But then if you have the universal healthcare and you have the basic income, then now you're essentially, let's say your spending would be $5,000 per person to do that for healthcare, instead of $7,000 or $8,000 per person that you would in a system of universal healthcare without basic income. So it does make what you spend go further. Same thing with education. So if we want to have a universal education system, have high school, college, these things, then you don't want students going in and being hungry during classes, not being able to focus on their studies or their tests. So poverty impacts this as well. Stressful home environments impact that. If your parents are stressed out because they're barely getting by every month and they're not sure how they're going to pay the bills, that impacts students' learning, and they learn less, their grades are reduced, and yet here we are spending all this money on education. So if we want to make that go further, so that students do better and they're actually able to absorb that education, then again, you got to eliminate poverty, and you got to eliminate, reduce inequality, reduce insecurity. Those things are all together. And when it comes to things like research, I think it's important to understand that, again, all of this stuff is publicly funded. Like that's how we get like basic level 1 research, is publicly government funded stuff, because there's no money in it. There's no money in just like trying things and just doing like really just basic kind of research. It's only once that research has been done where companies look at it and go, I might be able to profit from this. Let's pull this out and use it. And they get to use it for free. It was publicly funded. There's no risk, and they just get to enjoy the benefits. And what do we get? The response to that is, oh, well, we get whatever they develop, and now we get to pay for it. And it's like, well, that's like saying that that if you own Apple stock, that you shouldn't get a return on your investment. Your return is the fact that you can buy a MacBook. Like that's your return, that you can buy an iPhone and these things. And it's like, no, you don't accept that. If you put up the money and if it's your capital, then you should see return on that. And so I think that it's important that we recognize that this basic research and so much of what makes society possible is through taxpayer funding. And we should see basic income as effectively an ROI on our investment. And also it's a investment on our future. It's a future investment so that we can even build and do more as well.
We're getting towards the end of the program here, and I wanted to ask you 2 more questions. You are a policy advisor to a Senate candidate in Kentucky, Mike. I think Broyer. Is that the correct pronunciation of the last name?
Mike Broyer.
Broyer. My apologies. He supports, from my understanding, basic income proposals. Are there other politicians you're keeping an eye on across the nation at any level who are also starting to come around and back these ideas?
Yeah, so there's something called the UBI caucus, and I recommend that people follow UBI caucus on Twitter, and you can find it on the website too. And so the UBI caucus is a group of candidates running for office who have taken the pledge that they are in support of basic income, that they would vote yes on this legislation, and that they'll advance it. And that's a growing number of people. There's I'm not even sure what it's up to. I haven't checked recently, but I think it's up to around 40 or 50 people so far are running that have joined this caucus. So it's really interesting to see people in state after state come on board, running for the House, running for the Senate, even people running more locally, like for city council or these things like that. Like they want to push basic income out there as this new, essentially, policy of the future, where we, just as how Medicare for all, universal health care became such a thing last cycle, I think basic income was already becoming that thing this cycle with Andrew Yang's campaign. But now here we are in the middle of this pandemic, and it is just massively accelerated as far as being something that people understand more as being important. They're learning more about it. And I think that midterms, we're going to see a ton more candidates, both running who have not been part of office, and actually also sitting members of Congress who are now making it part of their platforms as well.
Well, Scott, and the last question I have for you, it's a bit of a pivot, and maybe a bit of a summary. But I like to ask everyone, through your work, through your career, and really through your personal life, is there anything that you ultimately hope to convey to other people?
I guess I just right now I want people to understand that they have intrinsic value as human beings. Um, it's it's a fundamental thing that we should recognize that we say that we recognize, let's say, the right to life. That we say it's important, that everybody has a right to life, and that, let's say, if you take someone's life, then maybe we take yours, or we put you in prison for like a lifetime. But it's also interesting that if you do something like that, and let's say you get put in prison for life, then you're essentially getting your basic needs met for life. At the same time as someone who did not commit a crime, they can actually die of poverty. And so, what crime did they commit? They didn't commit anything. The only problem here is that we as a society decided that we don't recognize their right to life, that we saw no value in them. We blame them as being, it's a problem of their own. That we don't look at poverty as a disaster when it is. Like we can look at this pandemic as a disaster. We can look at hurricanes and tornadoes and disasters, and then we put in federal relief, and suddenly trillions of dollars become available just like the snap of your fingers. But we don't look at that the same way when it comes to just general poverty and the general value of life. We should say, look, everybody has value. It's okay to be a human being. You don't need to be a human doing. It's just it's okay to just be, and we should recognize that and enable it. And we should want people to flourish and thrive as human beings, doing what's most important to them, instead of saying that effectively withholding food and basic resources from people and saying that you need to do what I want you to do in order to prove to me that you should live. People don't need to prove anything to anyone in order to live. That should just be a basic tenet of existence, that you should be able to be your own person and your life is valuable as you are.
Scott, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure's all mine. That is Scott Santens of the Fund for Humanity. Follow him on Twitter and follow the UBI Caucus. And thank you again, Scott.
Thanks, Alex.